transgender story is telling a different story that's going against the hegemonic stories. And that's why that's a very big deal, and it's also a very big deal because that potentially begins to, in our minds, to deconstruct, to see the possibility maybe the whole world isn't divided in this way. Maybe there are other ways of doing it. So that's what the title here means, using stories to perhaps change the system. Okay. So, first of all, stories make, prop up, bring down systems. Stories shape our understanding of the world, our ability to change it. So what we think we are in, think of your religion, which is a story. Think of your, it's a mythical story. Think of your country where you say, America is a great democracy, okay, compared to many places it is. But one of the things you're not going to talk about so much is slavery. When women couldn't vote, when they put the Japanese into internment camps in World War II, and then those other things. You're not going to prioritize those stories, unless you're some revolutionary weirdo commie, right? Because that goes against the story that we vote, we do this, we do that, we have democracy, we have freedom. So everything that you live in, that society, your religion, everything else is a story. I gave you the key words there, but I'm going to take them out of here again. And it says, but of course, like everything changes, like we talked about language changing, systems change. And so in the storytelling, we have to take into account all those changes. Here's a nice quote. It's what I just said about religion and state, but I'll mention it here. Any large-scale human cooperation, so it could be a nationality, it could be a religion, it could be sexual orientation when it's now a political movement, not a private, secret one. All of these things, whether a modern state, a medieval church or a modern church, an ancient city or tribe, is rooted in a common myth that can only exist in the people's collective imagination. Think about, if you're an American, what you learned in, I don't know, the 2nd grade, George Washington about the cherry tree. Now, did that happen? Well, because you didn't go, okay, would an American tell her about George Washington and the cherry tree? You didn't learn?
He got in trouble for chopping it down?
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
there's something more.
Yes, that he admitted it.
Yeah.
So he was, his total honesty, oh, he's a child, so I don't remember the things.
Integrity or something.
Yes, integrity, right? So Washington, we have to have a father of our country. That's part of the story, there has to be a father, just like in the family. Right? The family is the structure, the basic structure, then we have the tribal structure, and then we have the, so if we have now a nationalism where we're not really related, we create that same model. So he's the father of our country, so we have to tell the story about him, right? So that would be, so all of them is rooted in common myths that only exist in people's collective imagination. So part of what you learn in school, especially in the elementary school, is those collective stories that are handed down to make you an American, or I'm just saying American because we're here, obviously. In every society, schools do that, and in some societies, they indoctrinate you much more heavily, in fact. So, because that's what makes you us, to have a common story and to have a common language, right? That's why it's such a politically murderous thing in so many cultures to have groups have another language, right? Because that takes away from our commonness, which in America has been carried, although it's an immigrant nation, weirdly to an extreme of wanting to be a monolingual nation. And that's a weird excess of that, but it comes from that same idea. We can't be we. There has to be something, because what do we have in common? Well, really very little. Some of us have been here 5 generations, some of us came yesterday, some of us are citizens, we're different, sexual orientations, whatever. But we have something called that we're in America, or and how do we do that? Language. So that's one of the reasons that for that story has to be. And that even if you arrived yesterday on the boat, but you would be in the 2nd grade, you'd now have to learn about George Washington and the cherry tree. And I remember when I came to America that I had to pledge allegiance. Do they still do that in the schools? Okay. Well, is it all schools that do that, or?
No. Not anymore. I think it's like
You did.
Catholic.
But was it? Did you go to public school?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know exactly the rules. But when I arrived, and of course I wasn't a citizen for several years, and I couldn't even speak English, but I had to, it was in the 5th grade, and I had to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, so that was training me in that story, because that's a story too. I just repeat it every day. So all of these things we're talking about. So the story, and how do we do? By changing, so we do two things. Either we keep on repeating the same story. I'm going to see the wonderful example of that in the Silverman article in these 3 generations of the courtship narratives. But the 3 generations do change. They can't have exactly the same narrative because society is changing. So how do they keep up with the society but yet still stay in that box of getting married and having the 2.2 kids and the dog and the cat and all those things that you're supposed to have? How do they do that? So it says, but as narratives change, we can change 3 changes. Change the personal narrative we have about our lives. Okay, so the example I gave of the transgender coming out story would be an example of that. But not only that, you've seen what is very popular nowadays, life writing, memoirs of people, immigrant life writing, refugee life writing, drug addiction life writing. Why are those so important? What do they do? Number 1 here, change the personal narrative of our lives. So I'm going to heal by writing about how I overcame drug addiction, or how I became Americanized by being a boat refugee or whatever, right? So changing your personal narratives. Changing, but you can't do that by yourself either. For example, coming out stories, even before transgender, just regular coming out stories, in Hungary, they didn't exist because in that culture all of this was closeted. And so George Soros, a multimillionaire who gave a lot of money for this, he took English language coming out stories, had them translated to Hungarian so that Hungarians could read them in Hungarian, and that gave them, what, a new model, a new story that they could put their stories on and come out, as it were, even to themselves. You understand the importance of that. And they had no story if they couldn't read, and could only read. So that's number 1 again. Change personal narratives about our lives. So change your identity, just like we change our name, right? 2, change the cultural narratives that frame that the issues we advocate for. So I'm a big feminist, or whatever I am. I want to go against various things of a standard marriage or whatever. Let's say marriage for non-heterosexuals, okay? So I make new stories for that. So our political movements are in fact wanting to tell new stories. And finally, the largest ones, and this is the ones which is the hardest to get rid of, sometimes even we're political activists and we're saying, oh, we're against this, we're against that. We haven't seen number 3, changing the mythic narratives that influence our worldview. That is the cognitive, that's what George Lakoff talked about, the cognitive framework that's been hardwired. How has it been hardwired? But yes, but how does that function? What does it do? What is repetition? Yes, repetition, repetition, repetition. And it does it on the level of the word. So like when you say slut, 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 okay? It does it on the level of the micro discourses like Proverbs, beat your wife and beat the rug. It does it, so that's on the word, that's on the little discourse, and it tells it on the little stories that we're going to talk about, but now that are actually stories, and that can then become films, they can become novels, and when they become novelized, so when we talk about novels that are stereotypical, that are not good literature, what are we talking about? We're talking about exactly like chick flicks, supposedly, yes, or the romance novels. What are we talking about? This kind of thing that is inside some kind of box or some fantasy. So again, 3 levels. You can change your personal narratives or not change them. So the Silverstein is going to be an example where the 3 generations, even though the grandmother and the granddaughters don't have exactly the same narrative, they haven't really changed their narratives. They've gone, they know that society out there has changed somewhat, so they change a little bit how they tell their stories, but nothing has really changed. 2, change the cultural narratives that we have, such as when we're politically active, for example, and then 3, step out of that, break out of that cognitive framework somehow, and that is very hard to do. Because of the tremendous impact of dominant narratives or hegemonic narratives, and all those, and to some degree, are patriarchal. But by patriarchal, of course, women's role is in the patriarchal that you stay married, and you have those, in some societies, 8 kids, in some societies here only 2.2 kids, and a dog and a cat and a suburban house. So that may be different, but your role is still very gendered. And how do we change our cultural narratives? That would be because cultural narratives are powerful and emotive. So when these women are telling how they got married, they think they're telling their life story. But what are they doing? They are repeating and reproducing the cultural narratives of their time, and without having any idea that that's what they're actually doing. Okay, so that's the introduction. Now, let us look at the first one, which tells us a popular piece that tells us, by Barry, 2012. It's by a writing teacher whose name is Lorraine Barry, and she's she writes in newspapers, and she says she teaches courses in writing, and what she finds makes her very sad. It makes her even more sad because she realizes as a female she did the same thing when she was younger. The title of the article, Dear Female Students, Stop Writing About Men. Guys in my class don't feel the need to dissect broken relationships. Why do women? For that matter, why did I when I was younger? So what she says, she's seen hundreds of papers that they write, and what is the same story that so many of the women write about? A relationship. These are college students, so we're talking about that age right now. We'll see older ages. And what do they write about obsessively? The relationship that didn't work out. Why didn't he love me? I moved to the college he was in. I did this, I did that. Why didn't he love me? The desire to have this guy, etc. Why did they do this? And how come it is that guys don't do this? And then she goes back to her own life, and she says she has diaries too, and her own diaries embarrass her, especially from her late teens and her 20s. So she did the same thing. And that's why I see in these young women's papers this fear of being alone and the desire to be rescued from me in all of this. Whether that's the reason or not, we can discuss, but that they do this too much. And she talks about that she tells her students in editing tips on how to turn at least a single tale of woe, a personal story like this, at least into a universal tale of female longing. So that would be the difference between writing literature. So if you tell your everyday silly little love story, that's the same script. It's repetitive. It's like the Harlequin romance of personal stories. But if you have writing talent, you can take that story and make it into some kind of universal story of longing, make it in. So that doesn't mean you can't write about love or any of these things. It just means they're obsessively writing the same thing. Yes?
I guess like it can look weird from like a teacher's perspective, like reading all of these, but then I also feel like it's good that like women are writing about getting their hearts broken and like all of these situations, and like isn't it like more unsatisfactory for a male, like being able not to write about that?
I see exactly.
I feel like that's more of a problem than like women writing about it.
Well, I think they're both a problem.
Yeah. But like
It's like when we talked about single-sex talk in that unit, and we didn't get to do all the articles, but the key words, remember, if we looked at the backstage talk was an example of that, was that the women in talking to each other had this cooperative talk. So they do the same thing, not just in the writing, that they talk, and friendship, part of friendship is I tell you my personal problems, and then you say, oh, poor you, and we talk about it. And the guys don't do that. And when they get together, either they have this synthetic personalization about the football game, and or they tease each other, and that's why I wanted to do that, see that Harvard film that was a joke, but it showed it so well that remember when the girl, never mind that the roles are reversed, but when the girl says, I love you, and the guy isn't saying it back, tell me, and of course, then we see his part, he couldn't say it back, because all the other guys were sitting there. So that's what you're talking about, right? So he can't do it. So they're both problems. And you put your, you got to the central word, because that's the same thing that's going to be there. It's not even